In the winter of 1075, something extraordinary happened. A small Southeast Asian kingdom crossed into Chinese territory and attacked the Song Dynasty, not as rebels, not as raiders, but as a fully organized military force. It was a move no tributary state had ever dared to make. For centuries, Imperial China stood at the center of East Asia's political universe. Neighboring kingdoms paid tribute. They acknowledged Chinese supremacy. They avoided direct confrontation. But Dai Viet chose a different path. Instead of waiting to be invaded, they struck first. And in doing so, they rewrote the rules of regional warfare. At the center of this decision stood one man, General Ly Thuong Kiet, a strategist who understood something most commanders never grasp until it is too late. War is not won by reacting. War is won by shaping events before your enemy can act. By the mid-11th century, the Song Dynasty was under immense pressure. Internally, China was tearing itself apart. Grand Chancellor Wang Anshi had introduced sweeping economic and military reforms policies intended to strengthen the state, but deeply unpopular among scholars, officials, and landowners. Court factions were locked in bitter political struggle. Local elites resisted central authority. Tax systems were being reorganized. Militias were being reshaped. The empire was unstable. Externally, Song China faced constant threats from powerful northern rivals. The Khitan Liao dynasty pressed from the northeast. Western Xia harassed from the northwest. Song armies were stretched thin along thousands of kilometers of frontier. The imperial court in Kaifeng desperately needed stability. Instead, it was drowning in crisis. And historically, Chinese dynasties facing internal unrest often followed a familiar pattern. They redirected public frustration outward by launching wars against weaker neighbors. Dai Viet understood this perfectly. South of China, Dai Viet watched carefully. They saw troop movements. They intercepted intelligence. They studied court politics. They knew what was coming. An invasion was not a possibility. It was inevitable. Most kingdoms would have waited behind their borders, built defenses, prepared for siege, absorbed the first blow. But Ly Thuong Kiet rejected that approach. He knew that allowing Song armies to mobilize fully would mean facing overwhelming force on Vietnamese soil. So he chose something radically different. He chose preemptive war. The logic was simple. Strike before the Song could concentrate their armies, destroy southern supply bases, cripple logistics, shock the imperial court, force China into a reactive posture. If Dai Viet could dismantle Song infrastructure in Guangxi before the invasion began, they would buy themselves precious time and possibly change the entire strategic balance. It was a high-risk gamble. But Ly Thuong Kiet believed that speed and surprise could compensate for numerical inferiority. Late in 1075, Vietnamese forces crossed the border. They did not conduct symbolic raids. They launched a coordinated offensive across multiple strategic targets. First came Qinzhou, then Lianzhou, then Baizhou. Local Song garrisons were overwhelmed. Supply depots were burned, granaries destroyed, fortifications dismantled, communication lines severed. Finally, Vietnamese forces converged on Yongzhou, the most important Song stronghold in the region. Yongzhou was not just a city. It was the logistical heart of southern Song defenses. From here flowed food, weapons, horses, and reinforcements. Without Yongzhou, any future invasion of Dai Viet would become exponentially more difficult. The attack unfolded with astonishing speed. Vietnamese units advanced like a storm. Song commanders struggled to organize resistance. Messages to Ca Phang arrived fragmented and delayed. By the time the imperial court grasped the scale of the offensive, it was already too late. One by one, southern Song cities fell. Military warehouses went up in flames. Road networks were rendered unusable. Entire garrisons were wiped out. The psychological impact was immediate. For Song officials, this was unthinkable. Dai Viet was supposed to be a peripheral state, a subordinate neighbor, a tributary polity, not an aggressor capable of coordinated deep strikes. Reports flooding into Ca Phang described devastation across Guangxi. The emperor was furious. Court ministers panicked. How could a southern barbarian kingdom dare attack the heavenly court? But beyond wounded pride, something far more dangerous had occurred. Song's southern logistics had collapsed. Supply chains were shattered. Regional commanders were scrambling. Strategic planning was thrown into chaos. Ly Thuong Kiet had achieved his first objective. He had forced the Song Dynasty into crisis mode. Instead of preparing a controlled invasion, China was now reacting to disaster. And that reaction would shape everything that followed. But Ly Thuong Kiet was not chasing glory. He did not intend to occupy Chinese territory. He did not seek permanent conquest. From the beginning, this campaign had a single purpose: delay the invasion, disrupt enemy preparations, then withdraw. Because he knew what was coming next. After Yangzhou fell, Vietnamese forces pulled back. They did not linger. They did not overextend. They returned across the border carrying intelligence, supplies, and strategic advantage. Behind them, Song's southern defenses lay in ruins, but ahead of them waited something far larger. Retaliation. In Ca Phang, outrage turned into mobilization. The emperor ordered a massive counteroffensive. This would not be a punitive expedition. This would be total war. Over 100,000 combat troops were assembled. Another 200,000 laborers were conscripted to transport supplies and build roads. 10,000 cavalry horses were prepared. Siege engines, stone throwers, rocket weapons, naval squadrons. Command was given to Ly Thuong Kiet, a veteran general of northern campaigns. His deputy would be Zhao Zi, equally experienced. Their mission was clear: invade Dai Viet, capture Thang Long, restore imperial honor. But Ly Thuong Kiet had anticipated all of this. The strike on Yangzhou was never meant to prevent war. It was meant to reshape it. While Song forces reorganized, Dai Viet was already preparing the next phase. Defense, not passive defense. Strategic defense. Even as Vietnamese troops withdrew from Chinese territory, Ly Thuong Kiet began redeploying forces deep inside Dai Viet. He did not fortify the border. He did not meet the enemy in open terrain. Instead, he selected a battlefield of his own choosing, a river. The Nhu Nguyet, known today as the CSU River. This river controlled the most direct land route to Thang Long. It was wide, over 100 meters across in many places. Its banks were lined with forests and low hills. Its crossings were limited and predictable. If the Song army wanted to reach the Vietnamese capital, they would have to pass here. So Ly Thuong Kiet transformed the entire river into a weapon. Earth ramparts were raised. Bamboo palisades driven deep into the soil. Submerged wooden stakes planted beneath the waterline. Hidden pits dug along likely landing zones. Fortified camps positioned at key crossings. Naval units stationed downstream. Mobile forces prepared to strike supply lines. This was not a wall, it was a layered kill zone. Every meter was designed to bleed the attacker. And while Song commanders were still assembling their massive invasion force, Dai Viet had already turned geography into strategy. They had converted terrain into defense. They had prepared the battlefield. They had forced China to fight on Vietnamese terms. The strike on Yangzhou was only the beginning. What followed would become one of the most sophisticated defensive campaigns in medieval Asian history. A war not of brute strength, but of timing, positioning, logistics, and psychological pressure. Because Ly Thuong Kiet understood something timeless. Empires do not collapse when they lose battles. They collapse when their momentum breaks, and in the winter of 1075, that momentum was already slipping away. The Song Dynasty did not forgive. Empires rarely do. What Dai Viet had done in 1075 was more than a military raid. It was an insult to imperial authority, a challenge to China's prestige, and a public demonstration that the southern frontier was no longer obedient. In Kaifeng, outrage quickly transformed into mobilization. The emperor ordered full retaliation. This would not be a limited expedition. This would be a crushing campaign designed to erase humiliation. Across southern China, drums of war began to sound. Recruitment banners rose over cities and villages. Regional governors were ordered to contribute men, horses, grain, and equipment. Military depots opened. Blacksmiths worked day and night. Convoys of carts rolled south. The scale was enormous. Over 100,000 combat troops were assembled. 200,000 laborers were conscripted to build roads, transport supplies, and carry siege equipment. 10,000 cavalry horses were prepared. Siege engines were constructed, stone throwers, fire lances, early rocket weapons. Heavy naval vessels capable of transporting troops and artillery along rivers and coastlines. This was one of the largest southern expeditions the Song Dynasty had ever attempted. Supreme command was given to Nhu Nguyet, a veteran general hardened by years of fighting on the northern frontiers. He was known for discipline, caution, and methodical planning. His deputy would be Zhao Zi, another experienced commander. Together, they were tasked with restoring imperial dignity. Their mission was direct. Invade Dai Viet, capture Thang Long, force submission. Erase Yangzhou. From the Song perspective, this was not a war of conquest. It was punishment. They intended to remind Dai Viet of its place in the regional order. But even as Song armies assembled, Dai Viet was already moving. Ly Thuong Kiet did not rush north to meet them. He did not reinforce border towns. He did not contest mountain passes. Instead, he withdrew, deliberately, calmly, strategically. To outside observers, it looked like retreat. To Ly Thuong Kiet, it was positioning. He understood the realities of warfare against China. Song armies were massive. They excelled in open terrain. They relied on cavalry, siege machines, and overwhelming numbers. Meeting them in borderlands would mean fighting on enemy terms, so Ly Thuong Kiet refused. He would not give Nhu Nguyet a battlefield of convenience. He would choose his own. Deep inside Dai Viet, he selected a river, the Nhu Nguyet. Known today as the CSU River, this was not a random choice. This river blocked the shortest and flattest land route from Guangxi to Thang Long. Any army marching south would eventually be forced to confront it. Here, the river widened to over 100 meters. Its banks were lined with dense forests. Low mountains anchored its flanks, crossing points were limited, and movement beyond it funneled directly toward the capital. It was a natural choke point, and Ly Thuong Kiet transformed it into a fortress. He did not build a single wall, he built a system. Earthen ramparts rose along key sections of the southern bank. Bamboo palisades were driven deep into the soil, forming thick, interlocking barriers. Submerged wooden stakes were planted beneath the river's surface, angled toward the current. Hidden pits were dug along likely landing zones and covered with leaves and grass. 3 major fortified camps were established at Nhu Nguyet, River, and Phan Yang. Each could support the others. Each could receive reinforcements. Behind them stood mobile reserves. Naval units patrolled downstream. Supply depots were dispersed across villages rather than centralized. Civilian populations were partially evacuated. Food stores were hidden. Transportation routes were camouflaged. This was not passive defense. It was active denial. Every element was designed to slow, bleed, confuse, and exhaust an advancing army. Ly Thuong Kiet also understood something deeper. Wars are not decided by weapons alone. They are decided by logistics, morale, climate, and time. So while Nhu Nguyet prepared for a decisive invasion, Ly Thuong Kiet prepared for attrition. By early 1076, Song forces began their march south. They advanced with confidence, columns stretched for miles. Cavalry rode at the front, infantry followed. Laborers dragged siege equipment behind them. Supply wagons formed endless chains. To the soldiers, this looked like overwhelming power. But to Ly Thuong Kiet, it looked like vulnerability. Every soldier needed food. Every horse needed water. Every day of delay increased consumption. Every kilometer added strain. The Song army encountered little resistance on the way. Border towns were empty. Fields were abandoned. Villages stood silent. This was intentional. There were no heroic last stands, no desperate skirmishes. Only absence. Nhu Nguyet interpreted this as weakness. Perhaps Dai Viet was afraid. Perhaps resistance would collapse once imperial forces arrived. But what he did not realize was that he was being invited deeper into prepared ground. Behind him, Dai Viet guerrilla units began their work. Small mobile teams harassed supply convoys. Bridges were sabotaged. Storehouses were burned. Scouts vanished. Messengers failed to return. Nothing catastrophic, just constant friction, constant uncertainty. The Song advance slowed, not dramatically, but noticeably. Meanwhile, Vietnamese engineers completed their preparations along the Nhu Nguyet. Ramparts thickened. More stakes were driven. Naval patrols intensified. Communication lines between camps were tested. Reserve units drilled nightly. The entire region became a military ecosystem. When Nhu Nguyet finally reached the northern bank of the Nhu Nguyet River, he saw it. Across the water stood a fortified line stretching between forested hills. Earthen walls, palisades, watchtowers. Soldiers moving in disciplined formations. This was not a hastily assembled defense. This was deliberate, structured, professional. Nhu Nguyet realized immediately that his quick victory had evaporated. He had hoped to cross swiftly and advance toward Thang Long before Dai Viet could fully mobilize. Instead, he faced a prepared defense anchored by terrain. Still, Song commanders believed their numbers would prevail. They had 100,000 soldiers, siege engines, cavalry, fire weapons. How could a smaller kingdom resist this? The answer lay in the river, and everything beneath it. Song naval units were delayed. Vietnamese coastal forces under Ly Thuong Kiet harassed them relentlessly. Ambushes in narrow waterways, surprise attacks in estuaries. The Song fleet struggled to move inland. Without naval support, Guo Kui could not easily deploy siege engines across the river. Transporting equipment became dangerous. Pontoon bridges were difficult to build under fire. Every crossing attempt exposed soldiers to arrows, fire, and submerged obstacles. Time began to work against the invaders. The climate turned hostile. Rain fell. Humidity rose. Disease spread through crowded camps. Soldiers unfamiliar with tropical conditions began to weaken. Dysentery, fever, infections, horse fodder became scarce. Water sources were contaminated. Meanwhile, Dai Viet forces remained close to their supply bases. They rotated troops. They rested. They observed. Ly Thuong Kiet did not attack. He waited. He allowed the Song army to exhaust itself simply by existing. Every day, Guo Kui remained on that riverbank cost thousands of pounds of grain. Every delay eroded morale. Every failed reconnaissance deepened anxiety. Psychological pressure mounted. Vietnamese patrols appeared suddenly along the river at night. Drums echoed through the forests. Arrows occasionally landed inside Song camps. Never enough to cause panic. Just enough to remind them they were being watched. And then came the realization. The Song army was trapped by its own size, too large to move quickly, too dependent on supply lines, too far from home. They had entered Dai Viet expecting conquest. They had arrived at a fortress made of mud, bamboo, water, and patience. Guo Kui attempted reconnaissance crossings. Small units probed the river. Each attempt met concealed obstacles. Hidden stakes tore through boats. Soldiers fell into pits. Arrows rained from forest cover. Nothing decisive, but nothing encouraging. This was not the war Guo Kui had prepared for. He had fought on open plains. He had commanded cavalry charges. He had managed sieges. But here, his enemy refused to present a clear target. They had dissolved into terrain. Ly Thuong Kiet watched everything. He did not waste manpower on reckless assaults. He conserved strength. He observed Song camp routines. He tracked supply movements. He mapped commander positions. He waited for mistakes. Because he understood the next truth of war. An exhausted army eventually creates its own opportunities. By late 1076, the Song expedition had stalled. They could not cross the Nhu Nguyet. They could not bypass it. They could not advance without naval support. They could not retreat without humiliation. They were suspended in operational paralysis, exactly where Ly Thuong Kiet wanted them. The battlefield had been set. The trap had closed. Act 2 ends here. Not with swords clashing, but with an empire immobilized, and a smaller nation holding the initiative. Guo Kui still believed in momentum. Even after weeks of delay at the Nhu Nguyet River, he remained confident that once his naval forces arrived, the balance would shift. With ships, he could transport siege engines. With ships, he could bypass submerged stakes. With ships, he could establish bridgeheads across the river. With ships, he could finally bring overwhelming force onto the southern bank. Everything depended on the fleet. But far from the river, beyond the site of Guo Kui's camps, a second battlefield was already burning, out at sea. In narrow estuaries, among winding channels and mangrove-lined waterways. There, Admiral Ly Thuong Kiet was waiting. Ly Thuong Kiet commanded Dai Viet's coastal forces. He was not a court general. He was a river warrior. Raised among tides and currents, he knew every inlet, every sandbar, every shifting shoal of the northeastern coastline. His sailors grew up navigating fog, storms, and unpredictable waters. They fought differently than land armies. They did not rely on formation. They relied on timing, ambush, terrain, speed. When Song naval commanders departed from Guangdong and Guangxi, they believed their task would be simple. Escort troops upriver, transport supplies, link up with Guo Kui. Break the stalemate. They sailed in large formations. Heavily loaded, confident, they carried trebuchets, fire weapons, reinforced hulls. From their perspective, Dai Viet's navy was small and primitive. An afterthought. They were wrong. Ly Thuong Kiet did not meet them in open waters. He allowed them to enter river mouths. He allowed them to move inland. He waited until the channels narrowed, until currents slowed their progress, until escape routes disappeared. Then he struck. The first engagements were small, reconnaissance skirmishes, sudden arrow volleys from forested banks, fire rafts drifting downstream into anchored vessels. Song crews scrambled, ships collided, lines tangled, nothing decisive yet, but the pattern was clear. Every movement was being observed. Every anchor drop was remembered. Song commanders began traveling in tighter groups. They increased patrols. They posted more guards. But none of that mattered, because they were sailing blind. They did not understand the rivers. They did not understand the tides. And they did not understand that Ly Thuong Kiet was drawing them deeper into a kill zone. The decisive confrontation came at Hon Kiet, a narrow waterway bordered by dense vegetation. Here, currents slowed. Visibility dropped. Maneuvering large vessels became difficult. For Dai Viet, it was perfect terrain. At dawn, Song ships entered the channel in layered columns. They were tired, frustrated, delayed. They believed resistance would be minimal. Instead, they found silence. Too much silence. Then the shoreline exploded. Vietnamese warboats surged from concealed inlets. Arrows filled the sky. Firepots slammed into song decks. Small, fast craft rammed into larger vessels, punching holes below the waterline. Men screamed. Oars shattered. Sails caught fire. Ly Thuong Kiet had organized his forces into strike groups. Each had a role. Some attacked from the front. Others hit flanks. Others focused only on disabling rudders. Once a ship lost steering, it became prey. Song soldiers attempted to deploy siege weapons, but trebuchets could not pivot fast enough. Fire lances malfunctioned in humid air. Crews panicked. Orders were drowned out by smoke and crashing wood. Then came the second wave. Vietnamese infantry poured fire arrows from the banks. Hidden platforms released volleys into packed decks. Fire spread rapidly across tightly grouped vessels. Ships collided as captains tried to turn. Some capsized. Others burned. Men leaped into the river. Many drowned under armor. Those who reached shore were cut down by waiting troops. The battle lasted hours. By midday, Hon Kiet was choked with wreckage. Dozens of Song ships were destroyed. Thousands of sailors and soldiers were killed or captured. The survivors fled downstream in chaos. It was not just a defeat, it was annihilation. Ly Thuong Kiet did not pursue recklessly. He allowed remnants to escape. He wanted Guo Kui to hear what had happened. He wanted the fear to travel upriver, and it did. Messengers reached the Song land army with fragmented reports: ships lost, commanders dead, supply vessels burned, no reinforcements coming, no heavy equipment arriving, no naval support. Guo Kui understood immediately. Without the fleet, his entire operational plan collapsed. He could not move artillery. He could not flank the Vietnamese defenses. He could not establish river crossings at scale. He could not threaten Thang Long. His army was now trapped north of the Nhu Nguyet, pinned against a fortified river, with diminishing supplies and an enemy that controlled the waterways. The psychological impact was devastating. Song soldiers had believed naval power would rescue them. Now they realized no help was coming. Their empire's technological advantage had evaporated in a maze of rivers. Disease spread faster. Rations were reduced. Morale cracked. Desertions began. Officers punished men harshly to maintain discipline, but fear cannot be whipped away. Meanwhile, Dai Viet celebrated quietly, no grand ceremonies, no premature victory. Ly Thuong Kiet simply absorbed the information. The naval threat was gone. Phase 1 of his strategy was complete. Now Guo Kui was isolated. Now the Song army had no maneuver freedom. Now everything depended on crossing the river by force. And Ly Thuong Kiet was waiting for that moment. He reinforced the river defenses. Additional stakes were driven. Archers repositioned. Mobile reserves shifted closer to crossing points. Signal systems were updated. Every unit prepared for imminent assault, because he knew what would come next. An empire that cannot retreat will attempt to break through. Guo Kui had no choice. He could not remain idle while his men starved. He could not withdraw without disgrace. He would attempt river crossings, even without naval support, even against fortified defenses. Even knowing the odds, Ly Nguyen had done his job. The sea was closed, the rivers were secured. Now the war would return to the Nhu Nguyet, where Dai Viet had prepared everything. Act 3 ends not with victory songs, but with a silent realization spreading through the Song camp. They were alone, surrounded by hostile land, facing a river that had become a wall, and commanded by an enemy who understood exactly how to make large armies die slowly. By early 1077, Guo Kui had run out of time. His navy was gone. His supply lines were under constant harassment. Disease was spreading through his camps. And every day his men stared across the Nhu Nguyet River at a defensive line that refused to break. The Song Emperor had ordered a swift conquest. Instead, Guo Kui now commanded an army trapped in hostile territory. There was only one path forward, across the river. Guo Kui did not want to rush, but he could not wait either. If he stayed, his army would rot. If he retreated, his career would end. So he chose to gamble. The first crossing would be a test, a probing strike. 2,000 elite troops under General Miao Li were selected, lightly armored, highly mobile. Chosen for speed and shock, their mission was simple: cross the river, punch through Vietnamese defenses, create a foothold, signal the main army to follow. At dawn, engineers assembled a temporary pontoon bridge. Logs were bound together, ropes tightened, planks laid. Under covering fire from archers on the north bank, Miao Li's men began moving. They crossed quickly, silently. And at first, nothing happened. On the southern bank, Vietnamese defenders appeared to withdraw. Fires were extinguished. Positions seemed abandoned. Miao Li believed he had caught them unprepared. He ordered his men forward. They advanced inland. Breaking through light resistance, momentum built, confidence surged. But this was exactly what Ly Thuong Kiet wanted. The Vietnamese had not retreated. They had opened a corridor. A killing corridor. As My Ly's troops pushed deeper, hidden units emerged from forested slopes, from concealed ravines. From behind earthen embankments, arrows fell in dense volleys. War drums erupted. Vietnamese infantry surged from both flanks. The Song column was suddenly surrounded. My Ly tried to regroup. He ordered his men to form defensive circles. But terrain worked against them. The ground was uneven. Visibility was poor. Communication collapsed. Then came the final stroke. The pontoon bridge behind them was set ablaze. Flames climbed the ropes. Logs broke apart. The only retreat route vanished. My Ly's unit was trapped, cut off from reinforcement, outnumbered, encircled. The fighting was brutal and close. Vietnamese soldiers pressed from all directions. Spears stabbed between shields. Swords hacked at exposed backs. The Song elite fought hard. But they were fighting inside a trap designed weeks in advance. By nightfall, nearly the entire force was gone. Some were killed. Some drowned trying to swim back across. Only a handful escaped. My Ly himself barely made it back to the north bank, bleeding. Stunned, humiliated. When Go Kui heard what had happened, he exploded. 2,000 trained soldiers destroyed in a single day. And for nothing. He blamed My Ly. He blamed his scouts. He blamed the engineers. But deep down he understood. He had just walked into Ly Thuong Kiet's first net. Still, Go Kui refused to accept defeat. One failed crossing did not end a campaign. He would try again, with greater force. With heavier equipment, with overwhelming numbers. The second attempt would not be a probe. It would be an assault. Song engineers began constructing massive rafts, each capable of carrying up to 500 men. Infantry were issued axes and ladders. Archers were positioned along the banks. Stone throwers prepared to suppress Vietnamese defenses. Go Kui planned to force a breach by sheer weight. Wave after wave would cross. Overwhelm the barricades. Create multiple bridgeheads. Once established, cavalry would follow, then siege engines, then Thang Long would fall. On the morning of the assault, drums thundered across the Song camps. Rafts were pushed into the river. Soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder. Banners flew. Go Kui watched from a raised platform. His expression was rigid. He needed this to work. As the first rafts reached midstream, the Nhu Nguyet came alive. Vietnamese archers opened fire. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky. Some rafts burst into flames when fire projectiles struck. Men screamed. Others fell overboard under the weight of armor. Those who reached the southern shore faced bamboo palisades reinforced with earth. Behind them stood dense ranks of Vietnamese infantry. Above them, archers poured continuous fire. Song troops attempted to hack through barricades. Axes struck bamboo. Ladders went up. But every breach attempt was met by countercharges. Spears thrust through gaps. Rocks were dropped from above. Boiling liquids were poured onto packed attackers. Then the hidden obstacles revealed themselves. Submerged stakes tore open rafts. Men waiting ashore stepped into concealed pits. Legs snapped. Formations collapsed. Momentum vanished. Despite heavy losses, Go Kui ordered more rafts forward. He believed numbers would prevail, but each wave arrived exhausted, disorganized, already wounded. Vietnamese reserves rotated seamlessly. Fresh troops replaced tired defenders. Drums signaled coordinated counterattacks. Small Vietnamese boats darted out to disable rafts midstream. For hours, the river was a slaughterhouse. Bodies floated downstream. Broken shields piled along the banks. Smoke covered the water, yet no stable bridgehead formed. Eventually, Ly Thuong Kiet had to face reality. His men were dying in droves. The defenses were intact, and his army was bleeding out. He ordered a retreat. The second crossing attempt had failed. Worse than the first. That evening, Ly Thuong Kiet issued a brutal decree. Anyone who spoke of crossing the river again would be executed, not because he was confident, but because he was broken. The Song army entered a new phase, no longer advancing, no longer attacking, only surviving. Soldiers dug deeper trenches, officers tightened discipline, executions increased. Food grew scarce, disease spread unchecked, men whispered of curses, of haunted rivers, of southern spirits. Meanwhile, on the opposite bank, Vietnamese troops stood firm. They had not chased fleeing enemies. They had not overextended. They simply returned to their positions, repaired damage, replaced stakes, reinforced barricades, prepared for whatever came next. Ly Thuong Kiet had achieved exactly what he intended. He had shattered Song momentum, destroyed elite units, forced Ly Thuong Kiet into paralysis, and transformed the Nhu Nguyet River into a psychological boundary, not just a physical one. Now the Song army was trapped, unable to advance, unable to retreat, bleeding slowly under pressure they could not relieve. Act 4 does not end with a dramatic victory. It ends with silence, with exhausted men staring across dark water, with commanders realizing that brute force had failed, and with Ly Thuong Kiet preparing the next phase, not defense, but counterattack. By the spring of 1077, Ly Thuong Kiet no longer commanded an invading army. He commanded a stranded one. The failed crossings had broken more than momentum. They had shattered belief. The Song soldiers were still numerous. They still carried steel. They still flew imperial banners, but something had changed. They were no longer moving forward. They were merely existing. Every morning began the same: roll call, casualty reports, requests for medicine, requests for food, requests for reinforcements that never came. The grand invasion envisioned in Ky Thang had collapsed into a slow-motion disaster. The Nhu Nguyet River had become a wall, and behind that wall, Dai Viet waited. Ly Thuong Kiet tried to reorganize. He ordered tighter formations. He increased patrols. He punished desertion brutally. But discipline could not replace logistics, and logistics were collapsing. Song supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back into southern China. Caravans had to cross mountains, narrow passes, hostile villages, dense forests. Each wagon required guards. Each convoy consumed food just to transport food. And Vietnamese guerrilla units made sure none of it was safe. Small Dai Viet detachments began appearing everywhere. They did not fight battles. They ambushed couriers, burned granaries, poisoned wells, vanished into bamboo forests. Song soldiers started sleeping with weapons in hand, even inside fortified camps, even during meals. Even while wounded, every night brought uncertainty. Every shadow suggested danger. Every rustling leaf sounded like an approaching blade. Meanwhile, rations were shrinking. Rice was diluted with millet, then with roots. Then, with whatever could be scavenged, horses began to starve. Some were slaughtered for meat, others collapsed where they stood. Disease followed hunger. The southern climate punished northern bodies. Dysentery, malaria, respiratory infections, skin rot, wounds that refused to heal. Physicians were overwhelmed. Herbal supplies ran out. Infected soldiers lay untreated in muddy tents. Bodies were buried in shallow graves, sometimes not buried at all. Within weeks, thousands were unfit for combat. Not killed by Vietnamese weapons, but by heat, water, bacteria, and exhaustion. Guo Cui's officers sent increasingly desperate reports north, requesting food, requesting medicine, requesting permission to reposition. Replies were slow, vague, non-committal. The Song court was divided. Some ministers demanded continued pressure. Others urged withdrawal. No one wanted to accept responsibility for failure, so Guo Cui waited, and his army decayed. Across the river, conditions could not have been more different. Ly Thuong Kiet's forces were fully supplied. They rotated units regularly. Frontline troops were relieved. Fresh soldiers replaced them. Morale was maintained. Local villages provided food. Fishermen delivered fresh catch. Messengers moved freely along interior river networks. Vietnamese soldiers slept in dry positions, ate warm meals, treated their wounded properly. They were fighting on home soil, among their families, for their capital, and Ly Thuong Kiet never stopped working. He walked the lines, spoke with commanders, inspected barricades, adjusted patrol routes. He refined trap placements, strengthened weak points, moved reserves quietly. This was not passive defense. It was controlled pressure. Every day he denied Guo Cui action. Every night he allowed anxiety to grow. He let hunger do what swords could not. He let disease become his ally. He let uncertainty hollow out enemy confidence. Then he added psychological warfare. Vietnamese drums began sounding at unpredictable hours, sometimes at dusk, sometimes at midnight, sometimes just before dawn, echoing across the river, making sleep impossible. Poems were recited aloud from fortified positions. Most famously, the southern land is ruled by its king. This destiny is written in heaven. Those who dare invade will surely be destroyed. The words carried across water, through fog, into Song camps. Some soldiers believed it was divine prophecy. Others thought spirits were speaking. Fear spread quietly. Desertions increased. Small groups tried to slip away at night. Most were caught by patrols. Some were killed. Others were dragged back and executed publicly. Morale collapsed. Not suddenly. Gradually, like rot inside wood. Guo Cui found himself commanding an army that no longer believed in victory, only survival. And still, Dai Viet did not rush. They did not storm camps. They did not seek dramatic confrontations. They waited. They watched. They measured decay, because this was now a war of attrition, and time was their weapon. Every day, Guo Cui remained north of the river. His position worsened. Every day, Ly Thuong Kiet held the line. Dai Viet grew stronger. The battlefield had shifted from spears and arrows to supply wagons, medical tents, sleep deprivation, and morale. Modern military historians would recognize this instantly. This was operational strangulation, destroying an army not by annihilation, but by isolation. Guo Cui began to understand he could not win here. Not without naval support, not without secure logistics. not against a defender who controlled terrain, timing, and psychology. Yet retreat was unthinkable. The Song Emperor had demanded victory. Failure meant disgrace, exile, possibly execution. So Go Kui hesitated, and hesitation was fatal. Weeks passed, then months. Casualties mounted quietly, not in glorious charges, but in infirmaries, in latrines, in muddy fields behind tents. And all the while, Dai Viet waited, preserving strength, planning their final move. Because Ly Thuong Kiet never intended to simply outlast Go Kui, he intended to break him. Act V is not loud. There are no great charges, no cinematic duels. Only erosion, fatigue, psychological collapse, and the slow realization inside the Song command structure that this campaign was already lost. Go Kui did not yet know how it would end. But deep down, he understood something terrible. The river had defeated him. The jungle had defeated him. The climate had defeated him. And Ly Thuong Kiet had engineered all of it. And next would come the decisive strike, not against Go Kui, but against Zhao Zi. Ly Thuong Kiet had waited long enough. The Song army was starving. Its morale was fractured. Its command structure strained. Now came the moment to break it, but not directly. Not against Go Kui, not yet. He needed Go Kui distracted. He needed the Song commander to believe the main attack was coming from the river, and he knew exactly how to make that happen. Two men would carry that burden, Admiral Hong Chan and Admiral Chu Van, veterans of river warfare, leaders respected by every sailor under their command, men who understood what was being asked of them. They were given 20,000 troops, 400 warships, and one mission: attack Go Kui head-on. Not to win, but to hold, to draw fire, to pull every Song reserve toward the river, to become the visible battlefield. While elsewhere, Ly Thuong Kiet would strike the heart. The admirals were not deceived. They knew this was likely a one-way mission. But they accepted without hesitation. Because wars are not won by caution, they are won by sacrifice. Before dawn, the fleet departed Vientiane. Drums thundered across the water. War banners snapped in the wind. Oars struck in unison. From Go Kui's camp on the northern bank, the sight was unmistakable. A massive amphibious assault. Vietnamese ships advanced in wide formation. Archers stood ready. Infantry crowded decks. Signal flags rose, horns sounded. This was no subtle maneuver. It was meant to be seen. Go Kui reacted instantly. He believed this was the breakthrough attempt he had feared. He ordered every available unit to the riverfront. Elite infantry, cavalry dismounted, even his personal guard. The Song line thickened along the bank. Stone throwers rolled forward. Archers packed shoulder to shoulder. Go Kui himself took position near the center. He would not allow another crossing. The first Vietnamese ships slammed against the shore. Planks dropped. Troops surged forward. Swords met spears. Shields crashed. Arrows fell in sheets. Hong Chan led the left flank. Chu Van commanded the right. They coordinated through drum signals and flags. They rotated waves of infantry. They pressed relentlessly. Vietnamese soldiers fought with ferocity born of homeland defense. They pushed into Song barricades. They dragged wounded comrades back onto boats. They advanced again. Go Kui threw everything he had into stopping them. Every reserve unit, every mobile formation. The battlefield condensed into one brutal killing ground. For hours, neither side yielded. Blood soaked the riverbank. Smoke from burning ships mixed with dust from collapsing earthworks. Men screamed, drums pounded. Commanders shouted themselves hoarse. Hong Chan was wounded early. An arrow pierced his shoulder. He refused evacuation. He tied the wound. Returned to the front, Chu Van lost 2 ships beneath him. He climbed onto a third and continued directing attacks. His voice carried over the chaos. This was not a feint. It was a full-scale sacrifice. Designed to feel real, because it was real. Song catapults opened fire. Boulders crashed into Vietnamese decks. Ships splintered. Men were hurled into the water. But still the attack continued. Guo Kui watched through narrowed eyes. This was the enemy's main effort. He was certain of it. So he emptied his rear camps. He stripped Zhao Zi's sector of reinforcements. He committed everything. And that was exactly what Ly Thuong Kiet had been waiting for. While Guo Kui fought for his life on the riverbank, Ly Thuong Kiet moved. Under cover of darkness and distance, Vietnamese troops crossed at an unguarded section upriver. No drums, no horns, only silent oars. They landed behind Zhao Zi's weakened camp. The second in command of the Song army. The structural pillar of Guo Kui's rear defense. Zhao Zi had already sent most of his men to assist Guo Kui. His perimeter was thin, his watch rotations incomplete, his camp unprepared. Ly Thuong Kiet led the assault personally. Sword in hand, armor darkened to avoid reflection. He split his forces into 3 columns, one to seize command tents, one to torch supply depots, one to block escape routes. They struck at dusk. Vietnamese soldiers cut through outer guards before alarms could spread. Then fire bloomed across the camp. Tents ignited, granaries exploded, smoke swallowed the sky. Song soldiers woke in chaos. Some ran half-armed. Others burned inside their shelters. Orders collided. Formations dissolved. Zhao Zi attempted to rally resistance. But Vietnamese units had already severed communication lines. They attacked from every direction, short blades, close quarters, relentless momentum. The Song camp collapsed within hours. Thousands were killed. Survivors fled blindly into forests or toward Guo Kui's distant position. Some were cut down en route. Others drowned crossing streams. Later generations would call this place the Field of Bodies, because the dead lay so thick that horses could not pass. Back at the riverfront, Hong Chan and Chu Van were still fighting. They had accomplished their mission. But they would not survive it. A stone shattered Chu Van's vessel. He was thrown into shallow water, wounded, surrounded. He fought until overwhelmed. Hong Chan was struck by multiple arrows. He continued issuing commands until his voice failed. Then he fell beside his banner. Both admirals died where they stood, holding the Song army in place, buying time with blood. When Guo Kui finally received word of Zhao Zi's annihilation, his face drained of color, his strategic rear was gone, his supply depot destroyed, his deputy defeated, the realization struck hard. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and outwitted. The decoy had worked perfectly. Guo Kui had concentrated his entire army on the wrong battlefield, while Ly Thuong Kiet destroyed the core of his campaign. Act Vi ends not with victory cheers, but with silence, smoke drifting over burned camps, bodies cooling in mud, and Guo Kui standing amid ruins, understanding that the war had just been decided, because from this moment on, there was no path forward, only retreat. while Ly Thuong Kiet fought for control of the riverbank. Ly Thuong Kiet crossed somewhere else. There were no war drums. No banners, no horns, only dark water, silent oars. And men who understood this was the moment everything would be decided. The Vietnamese commander had waited months for this exact alignment. Ly Thuong Kiet distracted, Song reserves committed, Shaozi isolated. Supply routes exposed. The defensive skeleton of the Song army stretched thin. Ly Thuong Kiet personally led the crossing. He did not delegate. He did not observe from afar. He took a sword, boarded the first boat, and entered the river with his troops. The crossing happened at night, under low cloud, with mist hugging the water. Vietnamese boats moved upstream in narrow columns. Each vessel carried assault infantry, fire teams, and shock troops trained for close combat. They landed behind Zhou Zi's camp, not at the main gates, not at fortified positions, but along an unguarded stretch where Song sentries were sparse. Zhou Zi believed Ly Thuong Kiet was facing the primary threat. He had already dispatched much of his force to reinforce the riverfront. His remaining garrison was fragmented, fatigued, unprepared. The Vietnamese attack began without warning. Outer sentries were eliminated silently, ropes cut, signal posts disabled. Then the command was given, fire. Torches arced through the air. Oil-soaked bundles smashed into storage tents. Grain depots ignited. Ammunition wagons exploded. Within minutes, the entire camp was burning. Song soldiers woke inside a nightmare. Smoke-filled lungs. Flames climbed canvas walls. Men stumbled from tents half-dressed. Some grabbed weapons. Many did not. Vietnamese assault columns poured in from 3 directions. They did not pause. They did not negotiate. They moved with practiced brutality. Short blades, hooked spears, point-blank arrows. Shaozi attempted to organize resistance. He rallied a defensive square near his headquarters. But communication had already collapsed. Messengers were cut down. Officers died before issuing orders. Units fought independently, then broke. The Vietnamese did not allow regrouping. They surged through corridors of fire, cut off escape routes, separated formations, destroyed cohesion. This was not a battle. It was a systematic dismantling. Supply warehouses were burned first. Medical tents second. Command structures third. Only then did they turn fully on personnel. Song soldiers fled toward the river. Many were intercepted. Others drowned. Some disappeared into forests, never to return. The killing continued for hours. By dawn, Zhou Zi's base no longer existed. His command center lay in ash. His officers were dead. His garrison annihilated. The ground was carpeted with bodies. So many that movement became difficult. Blood pooled in depressions. Smoke drifted for miles. Local villagers would later name this place the Field of Corpses. Shaozi survived, barely. He escaped north with a small escort, but his army was gone, his authority shattered. His role in the campaign effectively ended. When Ly Thuong Kiet received confirmation of Zhou Zi's destruction, he did not speak. He simply closed his eyes, because now he understood. His army was no longer a unified force. It was fragmented, undersupplied, surrounded, and psychologically broken. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently. There would be no recovery. No renewed offensive, no return to equilibrium. From this moment forward, the Song army existed only to withdraw. Ly Thuong Kiet ordered emergency consolidation. Units were pulled back. Perimeters tightened, but it was too late. Vietnamese guerrillas intensified attacks on retreat routes. Convoys were intercepted. Scouts vanished. Panic rippled through Song ranks. Even Go Cui's senior officers began discussing evacuation, not victory. Evacuation. The collapse was not immediate. It unfolded over days. Increasing desertions, rising illness, shrinking patrols. Men abandoning armor, throwing weapons into rivers. Go Cui finally sent word to Ly Thuong Kiet. He sought negotiation. This was the unthinkable, the Song Dynasty, one of the great empires of East Asia, requesting terms from a southern kingdom. Ly Thuong Kiet accepted, not from weakness, from calculation. He offered safe withdrawal, provided boats, even supplied food. On one condition, immediate retreat. Go Cui agreed. He had no alternative. When Song forces began pulling back, Vietnamese units followed at distance, reclaiming ground, reoccupying villages, reopening supply lines. Song soldiers marched north in silence. No triumph, no banners, only exhaustion. Later records would show the scale of loss. Out of roughly 100,000 combat troops, fewer than 25,000 returned. Of 10,000 cavalry horses, only a few hundred survived. Hundreds of thousands of laborers disappeared. The financial cost exceeded 5 million ounces of gold. The political cost was immeasurable, and for decades afterward, the Song Dynasty would not attempt another invasion of Dai Viet. Act 7 marks the point where history turned, not through one decisive charge, but through timing, deception, and mastery of terrain and psychology. Ly Thuong Kiet had defeated a superpower, not by matching its size, but by controlling its movement, its supply, its morale, and ultimately, its choices. Ly Thuong Kiet could have pursued annihilation. The Song army was broken, its supply lines shattered, its morale gone, its commanders desperate. Another coordinated strike might have destroyed what remained. But Ly Thuong Kiet did not seek extermination, he sought resolution. He understood something many generals throughout history have failed to grasp. Victory is not defined by how many enemies you kill. It is defined by whether your nation survives stronger than before. Dai Viet had already achieved its objective. The invasion was defeated. The capital was secure. The Song army had lost operational capacity. Any further fighting would only cost Vietnamese lives. So instead of issuing another attack order, Ly Thuong Kiet wrote a letter. It was not arrogant, it was not threatening, it was calm, measured, almost compassionate. War brings only despair and loss. No matter who wins, families are separated and blood is spilled. If our two nations can set aside hatred and restore peace, both our peoples will benefit. Go Cui read the letter in silence. He had lost tens of thousands of men. His deputy had been destroyed. His army was starving. His mission had failed. This was his exit. He accepted. Vietnamese forces provided boats. They supplied food. They allowed Song soldiers to withdraw without harassment. It was not mercy. It was strategy. By granting the Song army a dignified retreat, Ly Thuong Kiet removed the need for desperate last stands. He avoided turning a defeated force into a cornered animal. He preserved long-term stability. The withdrawal began quietly. No victory parades. No speeches. Only exhausted columns moving north. Vietnamese units followed at distance, reoccupying territory, securing villages, restoring normal life. The numbers told the story. Out of approximately 100,000 Song combat troops, fewer than 24,000 returned home. Nearly 80,000 laborers were lost. Of 10,000 cavalry horses, only 317 survived. The financial cost exceeded 5 million ounces of gold. The political cost was far greater. The Song Dynasty abandoned southern expansion, not for years, for generations. They would never again attempt to conquer Dai Viet. A smaller kingdom had forced one of Asia's great empires into retreat, not through conquest, but through calculation. The war between Dai Viet and the Song Dynasty was not just a military victory, it was a strategic revolution. From this campaign emerged doctrines that would echo through Vietnamese history: depth defense, preemptive disruption, psychological warfare, operational deception, logistics targeting, controlled escalation, diplomatic exits. Ly Thuong Kiet demonstrated that modern warfare principles existed centuries before modern armies. He refused border defense. He selected terrain. He forced the enemy into disadvantage. He isolated their navy. He destroyed supply chains. He used feints to manipulate troop movement. He struck command centers. Then he ended the war before it became destructive. This was not brute force. This was systems warfare. His methods resemble concepts taught today in military academies. Shape the battlefield, control tempo, exploit logistics, break morale, offer off-ramps. But perhaps the most enduring legacy came not from tactics, it came from words. During the fighting, Vietnamese soldiers recited a poem across the battlefield, not as propaganda, but as identity. The southern land is ruled by its king. This destiny is written in heaven. Those who dare invade will surely be destroyed. Nam Quy Ca Sen Ha. It was more than poetry. It was Vietnam's first declaration of sovereignty, spoken aloud while arrows flew, recited while camps burned, carried on river wind. It told every soldier why they fought. It told every invader they would fail. This was not a heroic charge. There was no single decisive cavalry breakthrough, no glorious last stand, no cinematic duel. This war was won through planning, terrain exploitation, logistics warfare, deception, controlled escalation, and disciplined restraint. A smaller nation defeated a larger empire by mastering time, space, and supply. By forcing the enemy to fight on unfavorable terms, by turning geography into a weapon, by understanding when to strike and when to stop. For American viewers, the lesson is timeless. Power is not measured only in troop numbers. Victory does not always come from overwhelming force. And wars are not won solely on battlefields. They are won in logistics, in morale, in patience, in leadership. Ly Thuong Kiet did not seek glory. He sought outcomes. He did not pursue annihilation. He pursued stability. Nearly 1,000 years later, his campaign still teaches what many modern conflicts forget: that true strategic victory means ending war on your terms, not prolonging it, and that sometimes the most powerful move a commander can make is knowing when to stop